The call came while I was sitting in the back of a federal courtroom. My son was crying so hard I could barely understand him. "Dad, they took everything. Every card is declined. My accounts are all at zero." 20 minutes later, I found him standing outside the courthouse staring at his empty bank app in disbelief. Then he whispered, "The judge ruled against me. But I don't even remember signing the papers that gave her everything. The moment I opened the court file, I knew this wasn't a divorce. It was a carefully planned crime." Thank you for listening today. Before we begin, I have one small request. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever discovered someone you trusted was lying to you all along? Your answer matters more than you know. Just a quick note. This story includes some fictional elements added for storytelling and reflection. What truly matters is the lesson at its heart. The phone rang during the closing arguments of a fraud trial I was observing, and when I heard my son sobbing on the other end, I knew something had gone catastrophically wrong. I was 70 years old. I had spent 42 years on the federal bench presiding over Cook County's most complex cases: securities fraud, RICO prosecutions, white-collar conspiracies that destroyed corporations and reputations with equal efficiency. I had heard every variation of human deception, watched countless defendants unravel under cross-examination, and delivered verdicts that sent millionaires to federal prison. I knew the sound of a man whose world had just collapsed, that his friend choked out his voice raw in a way I had never heard before. "They took everything. My cards don't work. None of them work. Where are you right now?" I kept my voice level steady, the tone I had used 10,000 times to calm panicked witnesses. "Stay exactly where you are." I left the courtroom without explanation. The bailiff knew my face well enough not to ask questions. Vernon stood outside the Richard J. Daley Center. 20 minutes later, his normally sharp focus shattered into something close to shock. At 42, my son had built Harlan Financial Solutions into a company that managed algorithmic trading systems for 17 institutional clients. He was meticulous, analytical, brilliant with numbers in the way I had been brilliant with legal precedent. The man I found on that courthouse plaza looked like he had aged a decade in the past hour. He held his wallet open, credit cards fanned out like a poker hand that had lost. Visa, MasterCard, American Express. The black corporate card he used for client dinners. "All declined," he said, staring at his phone screen. "Every single one. I tried to pay the parking meter and it wouldn't go through. Then I checked my accounts. I pulled out my own phone and opened my banking app, navigating to the emergency access I maintained to Vernon's primary account. The arrangement we had made years ago when he first started the company, a safety measure neither of us had ever expected to use. Zero balance. The business operating account that should have held $240,000 showed zero. His personal checking, his savings, his brokerage account all frozen or emptied. "When did the verdict come down?" I asked. 23 minutes ago. Vernon's hands trembled as he scrolled through his phone. The judge ruled in Corinne's favor on every count. Property settlement, spousal support, the trust provisions, everything. And then he stopped, looking at the declined payment notification on his screen with the expression of a man watching his house burn down. "How did this happen so fast?" he whispered. The verdict was 20 minutes ago. I had sat on the bench for 42 years, watching men lose everything in divorce court, in fraud trials, in conspiracy cases that dismantled their lives with surgical precision. I had delivered those verdicts myself, watched bailiffs lead defendants away in handcuffs, observed the moment when comfortable men realized their comfortable lives were gone forever. I had never imagined I would watch my own son join them. But this was different. This was not the slow grind of litigation, the methodical process of legal destruction that took months or years. This was instant, comprehensive, and executed with military timing. Someone had been waiting for that verdict with their finger on a trigger. "Come with me," I said. "Not here." I guided him to a diner 3 blocks away, the kind of anonymous corner booth where courthouse lawyers met clients who did not want to be seen. The waitress brought coffee without asking. Vernon's hands wrapped around the mug like he needed the warmth. "Tell me what happened in that courtroom," I said. "Everything." He started slowly, his voice still unsteady, recounting the trial through the lens of a devastated husband. Corinne had testified for 90 minutes. Her attorney, a man named Brent Graves Vernon, said someone Corinne had recommended presented documents showing Vernon had voluntarily transferred his ownership stake in Harlan Financial Solutions into a new trust structure. Corporate shares, investment accounts, real estate holdings, everything signed over in a single coordinated transaction. "I don't remember signing half of those papers," Vernon said. "I was so tired during that period." Corinne said it was just estate planning updates, tax optimization. I trusted her. He looked up at me, and I saw the question in his eyes that he could not quite voice. How could I have been so stupid? But I was not listening to his self-recrimination. I was listening for the details that did not fit the small inconsistencies that always revealed the architecture of a lie. "She told the judge I signed the papers in your study," Vernon continued. "Said I used your pen to do it. Your signature silver pen. She described it to the court, the weight of it, the engraving, how you had carried it for decades." I went very still. "I don't own a silver pen," I said quietly. "I never have." Vernon stared at me. "What?" But she was so specific. She described the way the light caught the engraving, the way I had commented on how much it meant to you. "I have used the same black fountain pen for 42 years. I interrupted. "A Mont Blanc Meisterstück. No silver, no engraving. Your mother gave it to me the day I took the bench in 1981, and I have never owned any other pen of significance." How many liars had I watched over 4 decades, each one adding false details to make their stories sound more credible? The fabricated conversation that never happened. The invented object that provided false authenticity. The specific sensory detail designed to make a jury believe they were hearing lived experience instead of rehearsed fiction. Corinne had done exactly what every skilled liar does. She had built credibility through specificity. The silver pen was not just a pen, it was a symbol, a piece of family history, an emotional anchor that made the entire narrative feel true. Except the pen did not exist. I sat back in the booth, my coffee cooling in front of me, and felt something shift in my chest. Not grief, not shock. Something colder, sharper, more familiar. The same feeling I had experienced 1,000 times before when a witness made a single fatal mistake on the stand. And I realized their entire testimony was manufactured. She had rehearsed her performance carefully, meticulously building credibility with specific sensory details. But she had used a detail she could not verify. And that single mistake told me everything I needed to know. This was not a divorce. This was something far more calculated, far more dangerous. And whoever had planned it had just made their first mistake. I drove Vernon home and made sure he had cash for the weekend. Then I returned to my own house in Evanston, poured a single scotch I did not drink, and spread the divorce filing across my oak desk under the amber light of the lamp I had used to read 10,000 legal documents over 4 decades. The filing was 340 pages thick, and I had read enough legal filings in 42 years to know when someone was burying evidence in volume. Page 1 looked standard. Petitioner Corinne Elizabeth Weaver. Respondent Vernon Matthew Harlan. Grounds irreconcilable differences. The language was clean, professional, utterly unremarkable. But somewhere in these 340 pages was the architecture of what I had seen today, the systematic destruction of my son's financial life executed with precision that suggested months or years of preparation. I read slowly, making notes on a yellow legal pad, the way I had annotated briefs since law school. By page 40, I had found the first anomaly. Exhibit B7 was a financial disclosure form, showing Vernon's voluntary agreement to transfer his ownership stake in Harlan Financial Solutions into a new trust structure. The filing showed it had been submitted to the court on November 26 at 9:00 a.m. Standard procedure. Except when I opened the document's metadata, a habit I had developed in the digital age when liars forgot that electronic files carried invisible signatures. The creation timestamp showed November 28 at 11:43 p.m. 2 days after it had supposedly been filed with the court. I sat back and looked at that timestamp for a long time. This was not a clerical error. This was not a mistaken date entry. This was evidence that had been fabricated after the fact and backdated into the court record. I kept reading. Page 127 referenced security camera footage from Vernon's office building, dated November 12th, showing him entering the building at 11:47 p.m., allegedly to sign the trust transfer documents in private. The filing cited this footage as a corroboration of Vernon's intent to execute the transfers secretly away from business hours, suggesting consciousness of wrongdoing. But the actual footage was missing from the evidence file. The exhibit number was listed. The timestamp was cited. The footage itself was nowhere in the 340 pages. In 42 years, I had read thousands of case files. The guilty ones always had a signature, too much documentation in the wrong places, too little in the right ones, overwhelming you with irrelevant details while the crucial evidence quietly disappeared. This had that signature. I turned to the trial transcript, reading through the cross-examination that should have destroyed Corinne's case. Brent Graves had represented Vernon. I had recommended Brent myself 3 years ago, when Vernon first mentioned that Corinne wanted a prenuptial agreement review. Brent was competent, experienced in family law with a reputation for aggressive advocacy. But reading this transcript, I saw no aggression. I saw no advocacy. Corinne's attorney had introduced Exhibit B7, the backdated financial disclosure, without challenge. Brent had not questioned the metadata. He had not requested a forensic examination. He had not objected when Corinne's counsel presented the missing security footage through verbal description, alone without the actual video evidence. Page after page, I watched Brent Graves mount no meaningful defense. He asked soft questions. He made no objections. He challenged nothing substantive. It was not incompetence. Incompetent attorneys fought badly. This was something else. This was a performance designed to look like representation, while ensuring the outcome was never in doubt. How had Vernon's own attorney, a man I had personally recommended, a man whose career I had followed for 15 years, sat silent through an entire trial without mounting a single meaningful defense? I wrote on my yellow legal pad in the careful block letters I had used for 42 years. This was not a divorce. This was a heist. Then I found the addendum. It was buried on page 312 in the financial settlement details that most people skimmed because the numbers were overwhelming and the legal language was designed to obscure rather than clarify. The Harlan Family Trust, a structure my wife and I had created 28 years ago to protect generational wealth and ensure Vernon's inheritance, had a provision I did not remember authorizing. Section 703B. Automatic liquidation upon marital dissolution. I read it 3 times to make sure I understood what I was seeing. In the event of divorce decree finalization, the trust shall automatically liquidate all assets and transfer proceeds to the designated marital settlement account within 72 hours of decree entry. No trustee approval required. No court review. Automatic. The current value of the Harlan Family Trust was listed in the settlement summary, $22,400,000. 72 hours from the moment the decree was finalized. I checked my watch. The decree had been entered at 2:47 p.m. today. It was now 12:23 a.m. Saturday morning. That gave me until Monday morning at 2:47 p.m. 72 hours to stop a transfer I had not authorized into an account I did not recognize, draining a trust that represented nearly 3 decades of careful wealth management and family legacy. But if the liquidation clause had been inserted into the trust documents without my knowledge or consent, then someone had falsified legal instruments. And if Exhibit B7's metadata was backdated, then someone had manufactured evidence and submitted it to a federal court under oath. This was not just financial fraud. This was a federal crime. The silver pen had been Corinne's first mistake. But these documents showed something larger, a conspiracy that involved fabricated evidence, falsified trust amendments, and an attorney who had deliberately sabotaged his own client's defense. I stared at the liquidation clause for a long time, watching the numbers on my desk clock roll forward. 72 hours. Monday morning. 3 days to dismantle what Corinne had spent years building. I needed help. Not a lawyer, I had been a federal judge for 4 decades, and I knew the law better than any attorney I could hire. I needed an investigator, someone who understood evidence chains and federal procedure. Someone who could move fast and stay within legal boundaries, because if we gathered evidence improperly, it would be worthless in court. I picked up my phone and dialed the only man I knew who could move that fast. Terrence Stafford answered on the second ring. "I need a team," I said. By sunrise, Saturday morning arrived in a blur of 3 hours of sleep and too much coffee. I met Terrence at an unmarked office building downtown 12th floor. The kind of anonymous space where federal investigators conducted interviews they did not want recorded in official buildings. Terrence Stafford listened to my entire briefing without interrupting. Once then leaned back in his chair and said the words that would define everything that followed. Every piece of evidence legally admissible or we don't touch it. He was 54 and still carried the focused intensity of his 26 years in the FBI Financial Crimes Division. I had known him since he was a junior agent, testifying in my courtroom on a securities fraud case in 1998. He had built 100 federal cases since then, and never lost one to procedural error. No warrantless searches. He continued ticking off rules on his fingers. No hacked data, no chain of custody gaps. No witness statements obtained under questionable circumstances. If we cut corners, a good defense attorney buries us on suppression motions, and your son gets nothing. I wouldn't have called you if I wanted shortcuts, I said. I want evidence that survives appeal. He studied me for a moment, then nodded and turned to the 2 men sitting beside him. Alonzo Ramsey, Terrence said, gesturing to a man in his late 40s with wire-rimmed glasses and the calm demeanor of someone who spent his days staring at computer screens that would give most people headaches. Digital forensics. If there's metadata, deleted files, or electronic fingerprints, Alonzo finds them. He's testified in federal court 37 times without being successfully challenged. Alonzo gave me a slight nod. Give me access to the court filings, and I'll start with the metadata. If they fabricated documents, they left fingerprints. Clyde Garrett. Terrence continued, indicating a lean man with silver hair who looked like he had spent 2 decades chasing money through jurisdictions that didn't want to be found. Financial investigator, 20 years tracking offshore accounts and shell companies for white-collar prosecutions. If money moved, Clyde can follow it. Clyde was already making notes on a yellow legal pad identical to mine. I'll need access to Vernon's bank statements, corporate accounts, and any trust documents. I want to see where the money went after the freeze. I spread the divorce filing across the conference table and walked them through everything I had found. The frozen accounts, the silver pen that didn't exist. The metadata timestamp showing Exhibit B7 had been created 2 days after its official filing date. The missing security footage. Brent Graves's complete failure to mount a defense, and the 72-hour liquidation clause that would drain the family trust into Corinne's control by Monday afternoon. "Assignments," Terrence said when I finished. "I'll handle the legal side subpoenas for bank servers, court orders for security footage, document preservation notices. Alonzo start with the digital signatures and metadata. Clyde map the money trail. We reconvene at noon with preliminary findings." Terrence's rule wasn't caution. It was survival. In federal court, one procedural misstep could invalidate months of investigation and let a guilty defendant walk free. I had seen it happen a dozen times, brilliant cases destroyed because an agent had obtained evidence through a warrantless search, or a detective had violated chain of custody, or a prosecutor had pushed a witness too hard. We couldn't afford a single mistake. At 10 o'clock, I followed Alonzo to the digital forensics lab 2 floors down. It looked more like a server room than an office, banks of monitors, hard drives stacked in climate-controlled cases. The low hum of cooling fans creating white noise that somehow made concentration easier. Alonzo pulled up the electronic asset transfer document that Vernon had allegedly signed on November 12th. It authorized the transfer of his ownership stake in Harlan Financial Solutions, $18 million in equity, into a new trust structure that Corinne controlled. "Cryptographic signature analysis first," Alonzo murmured, pulling up verification tools I didn't fully understand. "If they forged his digital signature, the hash validation will fail. If they hacked his account, the private key won't match. If they..." He stopped. "What?" I asked. "Mere cryptographic validation passed." He looked at me over his glasses. "This is Vernon's signature. Not a forgery. Not a hack. The private key matches perfectly. This is his legitimate digital certificate, properly authenticated." I felt something cold settle in my chest. "Then how..." "Because he signed it at 2:47 p.m. on November 12th. Alonzo said, pulling up a second screen showing the system timestamp. "And at 2:47 p.m. on November 12th, he opened a third window, this one showing building security footage from Vernon's office complex. The timestamp read 2:47 p.m. The video showed Vernon exiting an elevator on the 14th floor, where Harlan Financial Solutions occupied the executive suite. But the man in that footage was not the sharp, focused executive I knew. He walked with an unsteady gait, leaning heavily against the elevator wall. His eyes were unfocused, glazed. He moved like someone who was trying very hard to appear sober and failing. At one point, he stopped in the hallway and put his hand against the wall as if the corridor was tilting beneath him. "He signed an $18 million asset transfer," I said slowly, while he could barely walk straight. "Legally signed," Alonzo corrected. "His credentials, his password, his biometric authentication. From a legal standpoint, this is a valid signature executed by the authorized party. How do you prove a crime when the victim's own hand signed the documents? His own voice authorized the transfers. His own body executed the betrayal. What could do that?" I asked. "Make someone functional enough to sign documents but unable to remember doing it." Alonzo pulled up a research database. Benzodiazepines, rohypnol, midazolam in high doses, anything that induces anterograde amnesia while leaving motor function partially intact. Medical professionals use them for surgical procedures, so patients can respond to commands, but won't remember the experience. "She drugged him," I said. Alonzo didn't correct me this time. The signature was real. Vernon had pressed that button himself, typed his password, confirmed the transfer, which meant whatever Corinne had given him that day, it had been enough to make him sign away $18 million without remembering a single second of it. We weren't looking for a forger. We were looking for someone who knew how to turn a human being into a puppet, and I knew exactly where to find the proof of what they had used. The proof we needed was in Vernon's blood, but getting a toxicology analysis required a sample we didn't have, and a subpoena we couldn't obtain without evidence of a crime. We were trapped in a circular logic that Corinne had designed deliberately. You need evidence to get evidence. But while I was thinking about medical records, Alonzo was doing what he did best. He pulled up the raw metadata from the court filing system at 2 o'clock Saturday afternoon, and the timestamp on Exhibit B7 made it impossible to ignore the document had been created 48 hours after it was officially submitted. Local timestamp says November 26, 9:00 a.m., Alonzo said, pointing to one screen. Court records confirm receipt at 9:00 a.m. But look at the cloud backup server timestamp. He pulled up a second window showing the automated backup logs from the court's server infrastructure. November 28, 11:43 p.m., he said quietly. 2 days later, I stared at the two timestamps side by side. He created the evidence after the trial started. IT director named Milton Ashford. Alonzo confirmed. He rolled back the local machine clock to backdate the file creation time. Standard trick for amateurs who don't understand how server architecture works. The local computer believed it was November 26th, so it stamped the file with that date. But the cloud backup server, the one that automatically copies every court filing to off-site storage for disaster recovery, recorded the true server time. Unalterable, unhackable, perfect chain of custody. Is this admissible? Federal Rules of Evidence. 902.13, Alonzo said. Certified records generated by an electronic process or system. The cloud server logs are self-authenticating. Milton Ashford fabricated evidence and submitted it to a federal court under oath. That's not fraud. That's a federal felony. I looked at the metadata timestamps and felt something shift. This was the first clean piece of evidence we had, something that would survive cross-examination, something a defense attorney couldn't suppress or explain away. But we needed more. At 4 o'clock, I drove to Northwestern Memorial Hospital. The company's chief accountant, a man named Gerald Moss, who had worked for Vernon for 11 years and would have had direct knowledge of every abnormal wire transfer, every suspicious account movement, every red flag in the financial manipulation, had been admitted to the ICU 6 days ago. I found the intensive care unit on the 8th floor and approached the nurse's station. The nurse on duty looked up from her computer. Rebecca Sloan, according to her name badge. 46, with the calm professionalism of someone who had worked intensive care long enough to know when family members were about to hear bad news. I'm here to see Gerald Moss, I said. Are you immediate family? No, I'm sorry, sir, she said gently. No visitors except immediate family. He's been unresponsive since admission. Severe traumatic brain injury. A different kind of dread moved through me. When did the accident happen? She checked her computer. December 9th. Hit and run near his home. The driver was never found. December 9th. 3 days before the divorce trial. His wife mentioned he was very stressed about testifying in court. Nurse Sloan continued. Some kind of business dispute. She said he'd been planning to bring documents to his lawyer. I looked through the observation glass at the man hooked to ventilator's monitors, tracking vital signs that barely registered as human consciousness. The only insider witness who could have testified about Corinne's financial manipulations, permanently silenced 3 days before trial. They had thought of everything. Fabricated evidence, eliminated witnesses, controlled the timeline. This wasn't opportunistic fraud. This was a military-grade operation executed with terrifying precision. I drove back to Evanston as the winter sun set over Lake Michigan, turning the water the color of slate. My house felt too quiet when I entered. I poured another scotch I wouldn't drink and sat in my study staring at the yellow legal pad where I had written, This was not a divorce. This was a heist. The phone rang at 9:15 p.m. Terrence. First bank subpoena came back, he said without preamble. Brent Graves received an $85,000 wire transfer on August 15th from a Delaware limited liability company. Shell Corporation, no identifiable beneficial owner, untraceable. I closed my eyes. 4 months before the trial, Terrence continued, deposited directly into his personal checking account. Not his firm's operating account. His personal account. How many years had I known Brent Graves? How many cases had we worked together? How many times had I trusted his word, recommended his services, believed he was one of the good ones who still cared about justice more than billable hours? 15 years, maybe 20. I recommended him, I said quietly. I told Vernon, this man will protect you. You couldn't have known, Terrence said. They bought him before Vernon even hired him. This was planned months in advance. I thanked him and hung up. Then I sat alone in my study in absolute silence. The colleague I had trusted had sold my son for $85,000. The witness who could have exposed the fraud was in a coma from a hit and run that happened 3 days before he was scheduled to testify. The evidence had been fabricated, backdated, and submitted to a federal court by an IT director who thought rolling back a computer clock would fool the system. And in 48 hours, the family trust I had built over nearly 3 decades would liquidate into an account controlled by a woman who had spent years constructing the perfect crime. I allowed myself exactly 5 minutes of grief. 5 minutes to feel the weight of my failure for trusting Brent Graves, for not seeing the danger sooner, for the naive belief that honor still existed in every courtroom. Then I picked up my pen and wrote a single word on the yellow legal pad. Sunday, 48 hours remained. It was time to stop reacting and start hunting. Sunday morning arrived with 3 hours of sleep and the certainty that came from having nothing left to lose. I was at my desk by 5:30 working through the timeline I had constructed on yellow legal pad pages, now covering half the oak surface. The phone rang at 6. Alonzo's voice was quiet, controlled, but I heard the edge of something underneath. I found the video. I was in the car 7 minutes later. The digital forensics lab felt different on Sunday morning, emptier, quieter. The hum of servers louder in the absence of human voices. Alonzo had 2 monitors running when I arrived, both showing the same elevator interior from different camera angles. Building management said the footage was deleted. Alonzo said, pulling up the first clip. They weren't lying. It was deleted from the main security server. But modern surveillance systems have redundant backup protocols, cached frames stored in the camera's local memory before deletion. I pulled the raw data directly from the elevator's embedded storage. He clicked play. The timestamp read 2:30 p.m. November 12th. The elevator doors opened on the 14th floor and Vernon stepped inside. I leaned forward, studying every detail. My son looked exactly as I remembered him before this nightmare began. Sharp charcoal suit leather portfolio under his arm, the confident posture of a man who had built a company from nothing and knew precisely what he was doing. He pressed the button for the 20th floor. The doors closed. "Now watch this," Alonzo said, pulling up the second clip. Same elevator, same camera angle. The timestamp read 2:52 p.m. 22 minutes later, the doors opened, and the man who stumbled out was barely recognizable. Vernon's gait was unsteady, his shoulders slumped against the elevator wall. His eyes were open but unfocused, glazed with a chemical distance that made him look like he was sleepwalking. He took 3 steps into the hallway, stopped, put his hand against the wall to steady himself. The leather portfolio lay forgotten on the elevator floor. 22 minutes, I said quietly. That's all it took. Whatever they gave him worked fast and wore off slow. Alonzo said, pulling up building exit logs. He didn't leave the building until 4:17 p.m., almost 2 hours after this footage. Security desk logged him as appearing ill but declined medical assistance. I watched the footage 3 times. The man who walked into that elevator was my son, the brilliant CEO who had built a company worth millions from nothing but algorithms and determination. The man who stumbled out was a ghost, wearing my son's face present, but absent conscious, but not aware. In those 22 minutes, he had signed documents transferring his entire company into a trust structure controlled by the woman who had drugged him. "This is admissible," Alonzo said. "Recovered from the camera's embedded storage with proper chain of custody. Time-stamped, authenticated, verifiable. A good attorney can't suppress this." "Send me a certified copy," I said. "I need to make one more stop." University of Chicago Medicine's toxicology laboratory occupied 3 floors of a research building that smelled like antiseptic and ambition. I had been here dozens of times over the years, bringing hair samples and blood work from criminal defendants who claimed they had been drugged, poisoned, or chemically influenced during the commission of crimes they swore they didn't remember. Ernest Riddle met me in the main lab at 10 o'clock. He was 63 now, silver-haired and carrying the calm authority of someone who had testified in federal court so many times that cross-examination felt like casual conversation. He had been my expert witness in 34 trials. I had never seen him successfully challenged. "Hair follicle analysis," I said, handing him the samples I had collected from Vernon the previous evening with written consent and witnessed documentation. "I need a comprehensive drug panel focusing on rapid-onset sedatives." Ernest took the samples without question. We had worked together long enough that he knew when I was building a case and when I was fishing. This was not fishing. The results came back at 11:30 a.m. Ernest set the printout on the lab table between us and pointed to a highlighted line halfway down the toxicology report. "Midazolam," he said. "Trace presence detected in multiple hair shafts, consistent with exposure approximately 4 to 6 weeks ago, which matches your November 12 timeline." "What is it?" "Surgical sedative," Ernest said. "Benzodiazepine class, used in operating rooms and emergency medicine for rapid sedation before procedures. The interesting part is what it does to memory." He pulled up a reference document on his computer. "Midazolam causes complete anterograde amnesia," he continued. "Patients remain conscious. They can walk, talk, follow instructions, even sign documents. But they form 0 new memories. It's why we use it before surgery. Patients can respond to commands during prep, but they wake up with no recollection of the experience." "How long does it stay detectable?" "In blood, 4 to 6 hours maximum. Standard toxicology panels run during that November trial would have missed it entirely. It metabolizes too quickly. But hair follicles are different. Once a drug is absorbed into the hair shaft, it stays locked there for months. You can cut your hair dye, it wash it 1,000 times. The chemical signature remains." "She knew that," I said. "She picked the perfect weapon." Ernest agreed. "Fast-acting, memory-erasing, and effectively invisible unless someone specifically looks for it, weeks later, in hair samples that most people never think to collect. How does a CFO with no medical degree acquire pharmaceutical-grade midazolam and calculate the precise dosage to incapacitate without killing? This meets Dobert standard," I asked. "Hair follicle toxicology is accepted science," Ernest said. "I can testify to chain of custody testing methodology and clinical effects. This is solid. Midazolam, a controlled substance reserved for operating rooms and emergency medicine. She hadn't poisoned my son. She had simply borrowed his hands for 22 minutes long enough to make him sign away everything he owned short enough that he would wake up hours later with no memory of what he had done. It was brilliant. It was monstrous. And it required access to controlled pharmaceutical supplies that no civilian should possess, which meant Corinne wasn't working alone. Pharmaceutical-grade midazolam didn't appear in someone's medicine cabinet by accident. It was a controlled substance with strict distribution protocols, prescription tracking, and federal oversight designed to prevent exactly the kind of abuse I was looking at. Which meant someone with medical credentials had supplied it, prescribed it, or stolen it from a hospital dispensary. Corinne wasn't working alone. The question was how many accomplices she had recruited for this operation. The answer came at 2 o'clock Sunday afternoon. Terrence stood in front of the whiteboard in the investigative office, dry erase marker in hand, and drew 4 names in a circle around Corinne's, each one a specialized weapon in a perfectly orchestrated machine. 4 accomplices, he said, connecting the names with lines that formed a web. Each one controlling a specific domain, each one operating independently but coordinating through encrypted communications we've traced back 26 months. I studied the whiteboard. At the center, Corinne Elizabeth Weaver, age 38, CFO, Harlan Financial Solutions. Around her 4 satellites. Brent Graves, attorney. Legal sabotage. Sabotage defense from inside Vernon's own legal team. Hugh Lockwood, bank director. Financial freeze. Executed account lockdown within minutes of verdict. Milton Ashford, IT director. Data manipulation. Fabricated evidence, backdated metadata. Deceased. Janine Madden, digital systems administrator. Forensic cover-up. Falsified digital signatures on corporate documents. Graves controlled the courtroom. Terrence continued drawing arrows. He made sure Vernon had no real defense, never challenged the fabricated evidence, let Corinne's attorney present a case that should have been torn apart on cross-examination. Lockwood controlled the money, every account frozen simultaneously because he had pre-positioned the freeze orders days in advance. Ashford controlled the data, created documents that didn't exist, erased footage that did. And Madden controlled the digital paper trail, making fraudulent transfers look legitimate in the corporate systems. How long? I asked. Alonzo pulled up a timeline on his laptop. First encrypted communication between Corinne and Brent Graves dates back 26 months. August 2021, 6 months before she ever met Vernon. Something twisted low in my stomach. She was planning this before the wedding. Planning, recruiting, and positioning assets. Terrence confirmed. This wasn't spontaneous. This was a military operation with a 2-year deployment timeline. By the time Vernon said his vows, the trap was already half built. 4 people, each one an expert in their field. Each one with plausible deniability if questioned individually. Corinne hadn't built a trap, she had built a machine, and my son had walked straight into the engine. What about the midazolam? I asked. Terrence tapped the whiteboard where he had written a 5th name with a question mark, medical source unknown. Still tracking, he said. Pharmaceutical supply chains are tightly controlled, but there are gaps. Hospital employees with access, physicians who overprescribe, black market suppliers. We're working through Corinne's known associates looking for anyone with medical credentials. Clyde cleared his throat from the back of the room. We need to talk about the money. We moved to the financial analyst suite at 5 o'clock, where Clyde had spreadsheets covering 2 monitors and printouts stacked 6 inches high on the desk. Corporate forensics on Harlan Financial Solutions, he said, pulling up the first document. Corinne had CFO access for 18 months. During that time, she systematically siphoned funds into shell companies, 7 entities registered in Delaware and Wyoming, all with nominee directors that make beneficial ownership impossible to trace through normal channels. How much? I asked. $3.2 million, Clyde said. Moved in increments small enough to avoid automatic fraud detection triggers. 50,000 here, 70,000 there, disguised as vendor payments and consulting fees that looked legitimate in isolation, but formed a pattern when viewed collectively. $3 million stolen over 18 months. It was significant, felonious, and exactly the kind of financial motive that made sense for a conspiracy this elaborate. But then Clyde pulled up a second set of documents. "Here's where it gets strange," he said. I ran deep background on Corinne's personal finances going back before she married Vernon. Offshore account tracing through correspondent banking relationships. And I found these. He pointed to a series of accounts registered in the Cayman Islands under the name Corinne Elizabeth Weaver. Hot $11 million, Clyde said quietly. Sitting in 3 separate accounts. The money's been there since 2016. Roughly 6 years before she married your son. I stared at the account balances. $11 million. From where, I asked. That's the problem, Clyde said. The money flows are deliberately obscured through multiple jurisdictions, Cayman to Luxembourg to Singapore and back. I can trace the movement, but not the origin. What I can confirm is that it's her money in her name, and it predates her relationship with Vernon by at least 2 years. She already had more money than most people see in a lifetime, I said slowly. Exactly, Clyde confirmed. She didn't need the $3 million from Harlan Financial Solutions. She didn't need Vernon's company equity. She didn't even need the trust liquidation. From a purely financial standpoint, this entire operation was unnecessary. If she didn't need the money, why commit conspiracy fraud and chemical assault? What could possibly be worth orchestrating this level of destruction? I looked at the account statements showing $11 million that had been sitting untouched in offshore accounts, while Corinne married my son, drugged him, and orchestrated a 2-year conspiracy to destroy his life. "Oh, people don't build machines like this for money they already have," I said. Terrence nodded. "Which means we've been asking the wrong question. It's not about what she's taking," I said. "It's about what she's punishing him for, $11 million of her own. She didn't need the company. She didn't need the house. She didn't even need the trust." Which meant I had been asking the wrong question from the very beginning. This wasn't about money. It was about something much older, much colder, and infinitely more personal. And I was going to find out exactly what that was. When someone orchestrates a conspiracy, this elaborate without needing the money, there is always a deeper motive. Revenge power or something buried so deep it takes time to excavate. I needed to understand what Corinne Weaver truly wanted, and the answer had to be somewhere in the documents I had been reading for 3 days. I pulled the Harlan Family Trust Charter from my filing cabinet at 11 Sunday night and spread it across my desk, searching for the answer to a question I should have asked from the beginning: why this family, why my son? The trust had been established 28 years ago, shortly after Vernon's 14th birthday. My wife and I had built it carefully with estate planning attorneys who specialized in generational wealth protection. The principal amount, funded through years of judicial salary savings, careful investments, and an inheritance from her family, had grown to its current value of $22 million. The structure was conservative, designed to protect Vernon from making reckless financial decisions in his youth. Standard trust language, reasonable restrictions. Nothing unusual until I reached Section 7, subsection D, disbursement triggers and liquidation protocols. I had written this section myself, working with the attorneys to craft language that would ensure Vernon demonstrated financial maturity before receiving the full inheritance. The trust would liquidate, converting all assets to cash and transferring the full amount to the primary beneficiary only when specific conditions were met. I read the clause 3 times to make sure I understood what I was seeing. Upon the primary beneficiary's unconditional assumption of sole control over all family enterprise assets, demonstrating financial stability and maturity, the trust shall liquidate in full within 72 hours and disburse the complete principal and accumulated interest to said beneficiary. Sole control of all family enterprise assets. I sat back in my chair, and felt the pieces finally click into place. The divorce was not the goal, it was the trigger. By stripping Vernon of everything except his company, by taking the house, the personal accounts, the investments, Corinne had created a situation where Vernon's ownership of Harlan Financial Solutions represented his sole remaining family asset. And because the divorce settlement had transferred the company into a trust structure that Vernon technically controlled, he now met the legal definition in the charter: unconditional sole control of all family enterprise assets. The trust would see Vernon as financially independent, managing his only remaining asset with the maturity the covenant required. And once that trigger was satisfied, the 72-hour liquidation clock would start automatically. $22 million transferred directly into Vernon's account, except Vernon's accounts were frozen, which meant the money would flow into the only joint account that remained accessible, the marital settlement account, controlled by Corinne as part of the divorce decree. I had written that trust covenant to protect my family's wealth for generations. I had never imagined it would become the very weapon used to destroy us. The divorce was not the goal, I said quietly to the empty study. It was the trigger. She needed him to have nothing except the company, so the company would qualify as sole control. 3 years of planning, 26 months of conspiracy coordination, midazolam-induced amnesia, fabricated evidence, all of it designed to engineer one specific legal outcome, triggering the automatic liquidation of a trust I had created to protect my son. She had read the charter. She had studied the disbursement protocols. She had understood the legal architecture better than I did. And she had married my son specifically to exploit it. The phone rang at 12:45 a.m. Monday morning. 14 hours until the liquidation deadline. Terrence's voice was tight. Mobile network records just came through. Subpoenaed from Corinne's cellular provider. You need to hear this. I put him on speaker and listened. Corinne's first logged phone call to Vernon occurred March 15, 2022, Terrence said. That matches the date Vernon told us they met at a business networking event. She approached him, introduced herself, they talked about financial software systems. He thought it was chance. But it was not, I said. Cell tower GPS triangulation logs, Terrence continued. Every time her phone connects to a tower, the network records approximate location data for billing and service optimization. Between January 8 and March 14, 2022, 2 full months before that first phone call, Corinne's mobile device was logged within 200 feet of Vernon's Evanston residence on 14 separate occasions. 14 times. She was watching him, I said. And it gets worse, Terrence said. During the same period, her phone was logged within 100 feet of Harlan Financial Solutions headquarters on 9 separate occasions. She was tracking him at home and at work, studying his patterns, learning his schedule. How many hours had she spent sitting in her car outside my son's home, watching him through the windows, learning when he left for work, when he returned, when he was most vulnerable? How many times had she followed him to his office, observed who he met with, calculated when he would be alone? When she was ready, Terrence said quietly, she walked into that networking event and made it look like fate. She chose him. She hunted him. I thought about Vernon telling me the story of their first meeting, the way Corinne had smiled at him across the conference room, the intelligent questions she had asked about his company's algorithms, how natural the conversation had felt. He had believed it was serendipity, random chance that brought 2 compatible people together at exactly the right moment. It had all been theater, every word rehearsed, every gesture calculated, the meeting engineered down to the minute. She chose him, I repeated, not fell for him, chose him. The way a surgeon selects a patient for a procedure. The way a hunter selects prey after weeks of observation, waiting for the perfect moment when the target is isolated, vulnerable, unaware of the crosshairs centered on its back. My son had never stood a chance. But the question that kept me awake until dawn, the question that made me pull file after file from my cabinet, searching through decades of case records and trial transcripts, was not how she had done it. It was why. Why choose Vernon Harlan specifically? Why spend 2 months surveilling him before the first contact? Why build a 2-year conspiracy to trigger a trust covenant that required marrying into a specific family? $22 million was the prize. But $11 million already in offshore accounts suggested money was not the motive. So what was? The answer had to be in her past. People do not build 2-year conspiracies without a reason that runs deeper than money. I had Terrence run a comprehensive background check on Corinne Elizabeth Weaver, going back to her birth certificate, tracking every name change, every address, every family connection. At 6 Monday morning, I stared at Corinne's maiden name on the background report, Weaver, and a memory from 15 years ago surfaced, like a body rising from deep water. I knew that name. I picked up the phone and called Terrence. "I need you to run a search," I said. "Federal cases I presided over between 2005 and 2010. Corporate fraud convictions. Last name Weaver." There was typing on the other end of the line, the sound of database queries running through federal court records. Then silence. "Wendell Weaver," Terrence said quietly. "Securities fraud case. Filed 2008 Northern District of Illinois. 15-year federal sentence. Presiding Judge Leland Harlan." I closed my eyes. Wendell Eugene Weaver. I remembered him now. Mid-50s gray suit, the kind of man who looked like he belonged in boardrooms and country clubs. He had orchestrated a securities fraud scheme that defrauded investors of $47 million, falsifying quarterly reports and audit documents. The evidence had been overwhelming. The victims had been retirees who lost their entire savings. I had sentenced him to 15 years in federal prison. He died in prison, I said, the memory coming back in pieces. By 6 years into his sentence, Terrence confirmed. 2014, medical records show complications from untreated diabetes. The prison healthcare system failed to provide adequate treatment until it was too late. Well, how old was Corinne? 23, Terrence said. And according to probate records, she was his only surviving family. No siblings. Mother died when she was 16. Wendell was all she had. I sat in the silence of my study and felt the last piece fall into place. She had been 23 when I sent her father to prison. He died there 6 years later. And she had spent every year since then a full decade building a weapon with my son's name on it. Not for money, for blood. The $11 million in offshore accounts, I said. Where did it come from? It's an inheritance, Terrence said. Wendell had hidden assets the prosecution never found. After his Corinne spent 2 years liquidating real estate holdings he had stashed in shell companies and offshore trusts. By 2016, she had recovered everything her father had stolen and hidden. She did not need Vernon's money because she already had her father's. And she used it to destroy the son of the judge who convicted him. I said, this was not opportunistic fraud. This was a decade of patient, methodical vengeance. She had chosen Vernon not because he was wealthy or vulnerable, but because he was mine. Because taking everything from my son was the closest she could come to making me feel what she had felt when I took her father away. The courthouse, the gavel, the sentence I had delivered with complete certainty that justice was being served. She had sat in the gallery that day, a young woman in her early 20s watching her father taken away in handcuffs. And she had decided that one day I would know exactly what it felt like to watch someone I loved destroyed by a system I could not control. I need to meet the witness, I said. Gail Whitfield, the former executive assistant who contacted you about the hard drive. 11 o'clock, Terrence said. Underground parking garage on the south side. She insisted on complete secrecy. No phones, no records, cash payment only. I arrived at the parking garage at 10:45 a.m. The structure was old, built in the 1970s, with concrete pillars stained by decades of exhaust and water damage. The smell of motor oil and dampness filled the air. Overhead, fluorescent lights flickered in intervals that made the shadows jump. Terrence was already there, leaning against his car on the third level. We waited in silence, watching the entrance ramp for any sign of Gail's vehicle. 11 o'clock came and went. 11:15. 11:30. At 11:35 a.m., Terrence's phone rang. He answered, listened, and his face went pale. Gail Whitfield was attacked in her home last night, he said, lowering the phone. Head trauma. Paramedics found her unconscious this morning when she missed a scheduled call with her sister. She's at Northwestern Memorial in intensive care. Oh, the hard drive, I said. Gone. Her apartment was ransacked. They took the external drive, her laptop, every piece of digital storage they could find. I looked around the empty parking garage. 3 levels of concrete and shadows. No cameras visible. The perfect place for a handoff that would leave no digital footprint. Except we were the only ones here. How did they know? I asked. Terrence shook his head. Someone talked, or someone listened. Gail told me about the meeting over an encrypted messaging app, but encrypted only matters if the endpoints are secure. I finished. If her phone was compromised, they read every message she sent. Who had I told about the meeting? Who had access to our communications? How deep did Corinne's network truly reach? I thought about the 4 accomplices on Terrence's whiteboard. Brent Graves, Hugh Lockwood, Milton Ashford, Janine Madden, each one with specialized skills, each one capable of surveillance, data interception, and violence when necessary. Gail Whitfield had promised evidence that could dismantle Corinne's entire operation. Now she was in intensive care with head trauma, and the evidence was gone. Corinne was 1 step ahead. Still. But standing in that empty parking garage with the smell of oil and concrete dust and a handful of hours left on the countdown clock, I realized something that changed everything. She had shown me exactly what this was about. Not money, not power, revenge, and knowing your enemy's true motive was the first step to defeating them. I looked at Terrence and made a decision. From this point forward, I said, I tell no one where I am going or what I am looking for. Not even you. No advance notice. No shared itineraries. No digital communications that can be intercepted. You are going off-grid, Terrence said. Completely. I confirmed. Trust is a luxury I can no longer afford. She has been tracking our every move because someone in our network is feeding her information intentionally or through compromised devices. The only way to get ahead is to operate in absolute secrecy. I walked to my car, started the engine, and drove out of that parking garage alone. A few hours remained. I was done playing defense. Operating off-grid meant no digital trail, no predictable patterns, no advance notice to anyone who might be compromised. I drove to 3 different locations before doubling back to the real destination, an independent law firm downtown where Stuart Dunn was waiting with the kind of discretion that came from 23 years of handling cases where confidentiality meant the difference between victory and ruin. He spread the toxicology report, elevator CCTV timestamps, and metadata analysis across the conference table at one Monday afternoon, and said the words that would define our legal strategy. Involuntary intoxication. Stuart Dunn was 58, with silver hair and the hard-earned reputation of a man who had never lost a trust dispute in his entire career. He had testified as an expert witness in complex fiduciary cases, written treatises on estate law, and built a practice on the principle that procedural precision mattered more than courtroom theatrics. He pointed to Ernest Riddle's toxicology report. Midazolam in Vernon's hair follicles proves chemical incapacitation, Stewart said. The elevator footage proves timing coherent at 2:30 p.m., incapacitated at 2:52 p.m., which matches exactly when he signed the asset transfer documents. Under Illinois contract law, when a counterparty knowingly induces or exploits chemical incapacity to obtain contractual consent, the resulting contracts are voidable for lack of contractual capacity. Will it hold in federal court? I asked. The doctrine is well established, Stewart said, pulling up case precedent on his laptop. Lucy v. Zemer established that contractual capacity requires mental competence at the time of execution. Illinois precedent extends this to chemical incapacitation if Vernon was under the influence of a sedative that prevented him from understanding what he was signing. He lacked the capacity to consent. The contracts are void. Clyde, who had been reviewing the financial forensics in the corner, looked up. That voids the property transfer. What about the trust liquidation? Same principle, Stewart said. The trust covenant requires Vernon to demonstrate financial stability and maturity. But the property settlement that supposedly proved his sole control of enterprise assets was obtained through chemical incapacitation. If the underlying contract is void, the trust trigger never validly occurred. He opened a draft document on his screen. Emergency petition for temporary restraining order, he said. We file within the hour. We present the toxicology, the elevator footage, the metadata proving document fabrication. And we ask the court to freeze the Harlan Family Trust, pending full evidentiary hearing. With this evidence package, we have probable cause. I looked at the evidence laid out across the table. Midazolam toxicology that proved Vernon had been drugged. Elevator security footage showing the exact moment his cognitive function collapsed. Metadata timestamps proving Corinne's team had fabricated evidence and backdated court filings. In 42 years on the bench, I had seen brilliant legal strategies collapse on procedural technicalities. Stewart was building this case with surgical precision, every piece of evidence legally obtained, every claim grounded in established precedent, every procedural requirement satisfied before we set foot in a courtroom. How long to draft the petition? I asked. I already started, Stewart said. We file within the hour. Emergency hearing this afternoon. If the judge grants the TRO, the trust freeze goes into effect immediately, and the automatic liquidation is suspended pending the full hearing. A few hours. We had a few hours to stop the Monday afternoon deadline. My phone vibrated. Terrence, I answered. Then Gail Whitfield is conscious, he said. Northwestern Memorial ICU, you need to get here. I was in the car 6 minutes later. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and recycled air. Gail's room was on the 8th floor intensive care with monitors tracking vitals that had been critical 12 hours ago when paramedics found her unconscious in her ransacked apartment. She was sitting up when I arrived, head wrapped in bandages, left eye swollen nearly shut, but awake and aware. 41 years old, having worked as Corinne's executive assistant for 18 months before quitting in disgust at what she had been asked to falsify. Terrence stood beside her bed with his laptop open. Tell him, Terrence said. Gail's voice was hoarse. I uploaded it to the cloud. 2 minutes before they kicked in my door. They got the physical hard drive, but they didn't get the backup. What backup? I asked. Encrypted mirror, she said. Private cloud server, secure login, only I control. Everything I promised you is there. Terrence turned the laptop toward me. The screen showed a directory listing with dozens of files, video recordings, audio transcripts, internal communications, financial audit trails. Screen recordings, Terrence said, opening the first file. Hours of them. Watch. The video showed Corinne sitting at a conference table with Brent Graves, Hugh Lockwood, and Janine Madden. High-quality audio clear video timestamp in the corner, showing November 3, 2023, 1 month before the divorce trial. Corinne's voice was calm, methodical, precise. When they ask about the November 12th transaction, your answer is that Vernon initiated the transfer himself during a private meeting in his office. You witnessed his signature. You had no reason to question his capacity because he appeared coherent and businesslike. Brent Graves nodded, taking notes. Corinne continued. Janine, if they question the digital authentication, your testimony is that the system showed no irregularities. The cryptographic signature validated correctly. You performed standard verification protocols. I watched them rehearse lie after lie, walking through depositions they had not yet given, coordinating stories that would be presented under oath as independent recollections. This is damning, I said. But there is more, Terence said. His face had gone pale. Look at this. He opened a second directory on the drive. The folder was labeled with a date 2018, 5 years before Corinne married Vernon. What is this? I asked. Terence clicked through the files. Dossiers, background research, financial analysis, surveillance photographs, all documenting a man I had never heard of. What had Corinne been doing in 2018? Who had she been targeting before Vernon, and why would she keep such detailed records of it? The recordings were damning. Hours of footage showing her voice calm and precise, walking her team through every lie they would tell on the stand. But it was the second folder that made my blood run cold. A folder dated 5 years before she ever met my son. A folder that suggested this was not her first time. Terence's finger hovered over the second directory for 3 seconds before he clicked it. The folder label read TK 2016, and when it opened, the screen filled with a face I had never seen. A man in his early 50s. Confident smile. Expensive suit. Salt and pepper hair styled with the kind of casual precision that came from regular appointments at places that did not call themselves barbershops. Across the top of the document in careful capitals, Thomas Keller, Chicago, deceased, 2018. Terence opened the first file and began reading aloud. Thomas Keller, Chicago real estate developer. Died May 2018, age 54. Cause of death, cerebral hemorrhage, ruled natural causes. I leaned closer to the laptop screen, the hospital corridor around us fading into background noise. Net worth at time of death, $8.7 million. Terence continued. Primary business, commercial property development in the Loop and North Shore. Divorced 2015, 2 adult children, no remarriage on record. He scrolled down to a section labeled Relationship Timeline. Corinne Weaver, he said quietly. Romantically involved January 2016 through May 2018. 2 years. 2 years. The same timeline she had followed with Vernon. The same careful progression from first meeting to total control. Keep reading, I said. Terence pulled up financial documents, estate records, trust amendments, beneficiary changes. I watched the pattern emerge like a photograph developing in chemical solution. 6 months before Thomas Keller's death, he had created a new revocable trust. Primary beneficiary, Corinne Elizabeth Weaver. The trust included commercial real estate holdings valued at $4 million, plus liquid assets totaling another $2 million. 6 months before death, exactly the same timing as Vernon's asset transfers. She isolated him from family. I said, pointing to correspondence records showing decreasing contact with Keller's children during the final year. Same playbook, new trust, new beneficiaries. Corinne listed as primary. The overhead fluorescent light flickered once, twice, then went dark. Emergency backup lighting kicked in 3 seconds later with a harsh white glare that made the laptop screen harder to read. Somewhere down the corridor, a maintenance worker muttered about the electrical system. Terence adjusted the screen angle and kept scrolling. Medical records, he said, opening a file that should have been sealed, protected by HIPAA and patient confidentiality laws. How did she get these? I scanned the physician notes. Dr. Marcus Sutherland, internist. Patient complaints documented over the final 6 months of Thomas Keller's life. March 2018. Patient reports persistent headaches, difficulty concentrating. Attributes, symptoms to work stress. Prescribed ibuprofen, recommended stress management. April 2018, follow-up visit. Headaches continuing. Patient describes episodes of confusion, short-term memory lapses. Neurological exam unremarkable. Recommend sleep study. May 2018, patient reports extreme fatigue balance issues. Scheduled MRI for following week. The MRI was never performed. Thomas Keller died 3 days after that final appointment. Headaches, I said. Confusion. Fatigue. Vernon has the same symptoms right now, Terrence said. I felt something cold spread through my chest. How did Corinne obtain sealed medical files? Terrence scrolled to a notation at the bottom of the digital folder. Estate legal representation, Brent Graves, attorney at law. Graves represented Keller's estate, Terrence said. He would have had legal access to medical records for probate purposes. He must have copied everything for Corinne's archive. Brent Graves, the attorney I had recommended to Vernon, the man who had sabotaged my son's defense from the inside. And 6 years earlier, he had been in position to help Corinne with Thomas Keller. This was not a recent partnership. This was a long-term criminal enterprise. Terrence opened the final document in the folder. Death certificate, Cook County Medical Examiner. I read it twice to make sure I understood what I was seeing. Decedent Thomas Michael Keller, age 54. Date of death, May 17, 2018. Location, private residence, 1847 North Astor Street, Chicago. Cause, cerebral hemorrhage. Natural causes, autopsy, declined by family. He died at home, I said. Alone. Shouty, no autopsy at family request. Terrence read from the notes section. Attending physician Dr. Sutherland, certified natural causes based on patient history of recent neurological symptoms. No investigation warranted, and she influenced that decision, I said. Through Brent Graves. No autopsy means no toxicology, no evidence. The perfect crime. Down the corridor, a nurse pushed a crash cart past us, rubber wheels squeaking on linoleum. The sound cut through my concentration like a physical sensation pulling me back to the present moment. Vernon was 2 floors above us in intensive care, recovering from midazolam poisoning that could have killed him. Or maybe not recovering, maybe declining, maybe following the same trajectory that had killed Thomas Keller 6 years ago. Do the mathematics, I said. Keller was 54 when he died. 2 years with Corinne from age 52 to 54. Vernon is 42. 18 months into the relationship, already in intensive care. She is accelerating the timeline, Terrence said quietly. I looked at the death certificate on the screen. No autopsy performed. Natural causes certified by a physician who had documented neurological symptoms for months, but never suspected foul play. A family convinced their loved one had died from tragic but explainable medical causes. Thomas Keller's children had buried their father believing he died from a stroke, brought on by work stress and age. They had no idea he had been murdered. Corinne had done this before. She had isolated a wealthy man, secured his trust, transferred his assets into her control, and then somehow, with pharmaceutical precision, ended his life in a way that left no evidence, no suspicion, no investigation. And she had kept detailed records of how she did it. Why, as a blueprint for the next victim, as insurance against her accomplices, as trophy documentation of a perfect crime. It did not matter. What mattered was that Vernon could die tonight and be ruled another tragic stroke. Another middle-aged man who succumbed to stress and neurological complications. Another closed case that would never be investigated. I closed the laptop and looked at Terrence. 42 years on the federal bench had taught me to see patterns, to recognize when individual pieces of evidence formed a larger picture, to understand when a defendant was guilty not just of the charged offense, but of something far worse. Thomas Keller's children had called it tragedy. I had a different word: murder. "We are not investigating fraud anymore," I said. "We are stopping a killer before she finishes what she started." When you realize you are not just protecting assets, but protecting a life when fraud becomes murder and every hour counts, you move faster than you thought possible. Within the hour, I was standing outside Judge Nola Yates's chambers with Stuart Dunn and an emergency motion that could save my son. I walked through the courthouse doors at 1:40 p.m. carrying evidence of conspiracy, chemical assault, and murder. Judge Yates was 59, appointed to the federal bench 12 years ago, with a reputation for running her courtroom with precision that bordered on severity. She did not tolerate unprepared attorneys, frivolous motions, or procedural shortcuts. But she also understood that emergency petitions existed for genuine emergencies, and when her clerk showed her our filing at 1:45, she cleared her calendar and called us into chambers minutes later. Stuart laid out the evidence methodically. Midazolam toxicology report showing Vernon had been chemically incapacitated. Elevator security footage proving the exact 22-minute window when his cognitive function collapsed. Metadata analysis demonstrating that Exhibit B7 had been fabricated and backdated. Cloud server screen recordings showing Corinne Weaver and her co-conspirators rehearsing false testimony they would later provide under oath. And finally, the Thomas Keller dossier. A man who had died 6 years ago following the identical pattern Corinne was now executing against Vernon. Judge Yates read through everything in silence. When she looked up, her expression was controlled, but I saw the flicker of recognition in her eyes, the moment when a judge realizes they are looking at something far worse than the filed charges suggested. "Your Honor," I said quietly, "the Harlan Family Trust liquidates within the hour unless this court intervenes. We need an immediate freeze." "Honorary Naniston," Judge Yates said, turning to Stuart. "Walk me through the toxicology. Midazolam is a controlled substance. You are alleging deliberate poisoning. Hair follicle analysis confirmed by Dr. Ernest Riddle at University of Chicago Medicine," Stuart said. "The concentration and timeline match the November 12th elevator footage showing Mr. Harlan's incapacitation. Under Illinois contract law, chemical incapacitation voids contractual capacity. The property transfers obtained during that window are legally voidable." Judge Yates studied the elevator footage, watching Vernon stumble out of the elevator with glazed eyes and unsteady gait. "And the trust liquidation clause?" she asked. "Triggered by the fraudulent divorce settlement," Stuart said. "If the underlying contracts are void, the trust trigger never validly occurred. But the covenant contains an automatic 72-hour liquidation protocol that executes regardless of legal challenge, unless a court intervenes." Judge Yates looked at me. 42 years I had sat where she was sitting now, weighing evidence and making decisions that would alter lives. She knew I understood exactly what I was asking for. "TRO granted," she said. "Trust assets frozen pending full evidentiary hearing. I am scheduling the hearing for 2 weeks from today. You have 14 days to build your case, Mr. Harlan. Do not waste them." I exhaled for the first time in 3 days. Vernon was safe until the hearing, but 14 days was not forever. "Before I tell you what happened when Corinne found out, are you still with me? Comment A if you think she'll fight, or B if you think she'll run, and add one reason." Quick note: what follows includes recreated dialogue for narrative impact. The lesson is what matters. The U.S. Marshal served Corinne with the TRO at 3:15 p.m. Monday afternoon. Legal protocol required her to be notified immediately that the trust assets were frozen, and any attempt to access or transfer funds would constitute contempt of court. 90 minutes later, Vernon's phone rang. I was at his house when it happened, having driven there directly from the courthouse. Vernon was recovering on the living room couch, still weak from the midazolam that had nearly killed him, but conscious and aware to understand what we had discovered over the past 4 days. When his phone showed Corinne's number, I gestured for him to answer and put it on speaker. I had recording equipment ready, legally obtained, properly disclosed, admissible in court. Vernon accepted the call. "Vernon, darling." Corinne's voice came through the speaker with perfect calibration. Warm, but not overly affectionate. Concerned, but not panicked. The voice of a woman addressing a minor inconvenience. "There has been a minor legal misunderstanding. My team is handling it. I wanted you to hear from me directly so you would not worry." Vernon looked at me. I nodded. "Dad is here with me, Corinne," Vernon said. "He knows everything." The line went silent. 3 seconds of absolute quiet. No background noise, no breathing. Just dead air while a predator calculated whether to fight or flee. When Corinne spoke again, her voice had changed. Not dramatically, 99% of people would not have noticed the shift. But I had spent 42 years listening to defendants lie under oath, and I heard the micro-strain. The hairline fracture in the performance. For one fraction of a second, her composure cracked. "I see," she said. "Then I suppose we will resolve this in court. I have excellent attorneys." The crack sealed. The performance resumed. Within 3 seconds, she was back to perfect control. "I am disappointed you would believe these accusations without hearing my side, Vernon," she continued. "But I understand your father has always been protective. We will let the legal system determine the truth." She ended the call. I looked at Vernon and saw the question in his eyes was that her reaction to having a federal judge freeze millions of dollars and expose a conspiracy that had taken years to build. Yes, that was exactly her reaction. Because Corinne Weaver was not an amateur caught off guard by unexpected resistance. She was a professional who had successfully executed this operation at least once before. She had contingency plans. She had escape routes. She had spent a decade building redundancies into her criminal enterprise specifically for moments like this. Her voice had betrayed her for one fraction of a second, the micro-strain of a chess master realizing the board had turned against her, but she recovered in 3 seconds. The great ones always do. That was why I had 14 days to finish this before she adapted, rebuilt her defense, and found a way to turn the game back in her favor. 14 days sounds like plenty of time until you realize your opponent is spending those same 14 days building countermeasures, destroying evidence, and pressuring witnesses to change their stories. Corinne had recovered her composure in 3 seconds. That kind of control meant she was already 3 moves ahead of wherever I thought she was, which meant I needed to be 6 moves ahead of her. Terrence drew 3 columns on the whiteboard at our off-grid office Tuesday afternoon. Evidence we show, evidence we hide, perjury count, and I began building the trap. "The evidentiary hearing is our opportunity," I said. "Judge Yates will evaluate whether the TRO should become permanent. Corinne will testify. Brent Graves will testify. We control the order of evidence presentation." Stuart Dunn studied the whiteboard. "You want to sandbag. I want to give her confidence," I said. "We present the elevator CCTV first. Clear video showing Vernon incapacitated, but circumstantial defense can argue medical episode, stress-induced vertigo, any number of alternative explanations. Then we present the system access logs showing unusual login patterns. Suspicious, but not definitive. Weak evidence," Terrence said, understanding immediately. "She takes the stand feeling confident because she has prepared answers for the circumstantial material. And under oath," I continued, "she denies everything. No knowledge of any drugging. No awareness of Vernon's incapacitation. Complete fabrication by a vindictive ex-father-in-law. Perjury, Stewart said. 18 U.S.C. Section 1621, I confirmed. Then after she has committed to her denial under oath, we introduced the cloud screen recordings. Hours of footage showing her hands on Vernon's keyboard. Her voice rehearsing the false testimony she just provided. Toxicology results proving midazolam in his system during the exact time frame of the transfers. Chess masters do not win by playing the obvious move. They win by making their opponent believe they are safe, comfortable, in control. Then they spring the trap when escape is impossible. 5 years per false statement under oath. I said. Wire fraud carries 20 years. Obstruction of justice adds another 20. Conspiracy to commit murder if we can establish the Thomas Keller connection carries life. She will take a plea deal to avoid trial, and when she falls, everyone in her network falls with her. Terrence added names to the whiteboard under perjury count. Brent Graves, Hugh Lockwood, Janine Madden, Milton Ashford deceased, but his role documented. Each one facing federal charges, each one with incentive to cooperate against Corinne to reduce their own exposure. We need to flip one of them before the hearing, Stewart said. Establish that the conspiracy is fracturing. Give the others reason to believe cooperation is their only path. Janine Madden, I said. Digital Systems Administrator, 31 years old, no prior criminal record, lowest level participant with the most to lose and the least loyalty to Corinne. Stewart made a phone call. 3 hours later, at 6:45 p.m., we were sitting across from Janine Madden and her attorney, Marcus Caldwell, in a private conference room at an independent law firm. Janine was younger than I expected. Pale, nervous, her hands trembling slightly, as Stewart laid the screen recordings on the table between us. Ms. Madden, Stewart said quietly, these recordings show your terminal ID executing digital signature falsifications on trust transfer documents. Your exposure is significant. Wire fraud, conspiracy, 5 to 10 years in federal prison. Marcus Caldwell, a criminal defense attorney in his 40s who had built a career on negotiating favorable plea agreements, leaned forward. My client is willing to cooperate in exchange for immunity consideration, he said. Proffer agreement, Stewart countered. Full cooperation, complete testimony, written documentation of every instruction she received and every action she took. In exchange, we recommend non-custodial sentencing, probation, community service, no prison time. Janine looked at her attorney. He nodded. Jean-Corinne Weaver directed every modification. Janine said, her voice barely above a whisper. I have the email timestamps, her written instructions, technical specifications for how to backdate the metadata and make the signatures appear legitimate. She signed the proffer agreement 20 minutes later. The weakest link in the conspiracy had broken. The others would follow. I drove to Vernon's house at 9 o'clock that night. He was sitting in the living room where I had found him 5 days ago, but he looked different now, stronger, clearer. The chemical fog lifted and the confusion replaced by something harder. I sat across from him and told him everything. The silver pen that did not exist. Wendell Weaver, convicted 15 years ago, dying in prison while his daughter watched and planned her revenge. The midazolam that had turned him into a puppet who could sign away millions without forming a single memory. The elevator footage showing his transformation from CEO to incapacitated victim in 22 minutes. And finally, Thomas Keller, Chicago real estate developer, dead in 2018 from a cerebral hemorrhage ruled natural causes, 2 years with Corinne, asset transfers 6 months before death, the same pattern, the same ending. She has done this before, I said. She has killed before, and you were next. Vernon listened in absolute silence. When I finished, he sat without moving for a long time. How long have you known? He asked finally. Since the silver pen, I said. The moment you mentioned it, I knew something was wrong. Everything after that was following the thread until I found where it led. Vernon closed his eyes for 10 seconds. When he opened them again, I saw the man my son had been before Corinne, sharp, focused, capable. The man he could be again. Tell me what I need to do, Vernon said. And in that moment I knew we would win. Not because the evidence was overwhelming, though it was. Not because the law was on our side, though it was. But because my son had made the decision to fight back, to testify, to stand in that courtroom, and face the woman who had nearly destroyed him. Corinne had 14 days to dismantle everything we had built. But she had made one critical miscalculation. She had underestimated what a father would do to save his son. What my son needed to do was simple trust. The process? Trust the evidence and trust that I had spent 42 years learning how to win in courtrooms exactly like this one. 2 weeks passed in preparation, witness interviews, evidence organization, procedural motions, and then Wednesday morning arrived with the weight of everything we had built resting on the next 6 hours. The oak doors of courtroom 2506 swung open, and I walked into the arena where my son's life would be decided. The federal courthouse smelled like old wood and newer carpet, the kind of institutional blend that never quite masked the underlying scent of tension and consequence. Judge Nola Yates sat at the bench, her expression neutral, but her eyes sharp. Vernon sat beside Stuart Dunn at the petitioner's table, looking stronger than he had 2 weeks ago, but still carrying the weight of what Corinne had done to him. Corinne sat across the aisle at the respondents' table with Brent Graves wearing a navy suit that projected professional competence and wounded dignity in equal measure. She did not look at Vernon. She did not look at me. She stared straight ahead with the composure of someone who believed the next few hours would vindicate her completely. Judge Yates called the hearing to order at 9 o'clock sharp. Emergency evidentiary hearing on temporary restraining order continuation and motion to vacate divorce decree, she said. Mr. Dunn, you filed the emergency petition. Present your case. Stuart stood and began laying out the evidence exactly as we had planned. Week first. Circumstantial. The kind of material that sounded suspicious but left room for alternative explanations. Your Honor, we present metadata evidence showing unauthorized access to trust documents during hours when Mr. Vernon Harlan was hospitalized following the divorce verdict. Stuart said, pulling up digital timestamps on the courtroom display. These access logs demonstrate a pattern of document manipulation occurring after the legal proceedings had concluded. Brent Graves leaned back in his chair, taking minimal notes. I could see the confidence in his posture, the relaxed shoulders of an attorney who had prepared his client for exactly this evidence and knew he could dismantle it. Yikes, la. We also present elevator security footage. Stuart continued playing the video showing Corinne entering the Harlan Financial Solutions building at 11:47 p.m. on the night the accounts were frozen. Ms. Weaver accessed her husband's corporate offices during non-business hours immediately following the court's ruling. Judge Yates studied the footage with an expression I recognized from 4 decades of courtroom observation. Skepticism. The look of a judge wondering if this was really the compelling evidence that had justified freezing millions of dollars in trust assets. Metadata and hallway footage. Brent Graves said, standing. This is the emergency evidence justifying asset freeze of a 9-figure trust. Your Honor, Ms. Weaver had every legal right to access her husband's office. This metadata proves nothing except a witch hunt orchestrated by a vindictive former judge who cannot accept that his son's marriage ended badly. He was good, aggressive without being theatrical, dismissive without appearing arrogant. Exactly the kind of defense attorney who could make circumstantial evidence disappear under the weight of reasonable doubt. Your Honor, Brent continued, Counsel has frozen my client's assets based on the fact that she walked into her own husband's building and accessed business documents she had every legal right to review as CFO of the company. We ask the court to dissolve the TRO immediately and award sanctions against opposing counsel for abuse of emergency procedures. Brent Graves was a shark smelling blood in the water. But he did not know the blood was bait. Corinne sat perfectly still at the defense table, her hands folded in front of her, her expression one of patient endurance. She glanced once at Vernon, a look of calibrated concern that hit exactly the right note. Not too much emotion, which would seem performative. Not too little, which would seem cold. Just enough to project the image of a woman who still cared about her ex-husband, despite his family's baseless accusations. I watched her micro-expressions and saw what I needed to see. She believed she was winning. Judge Yates looked at Stewart with the expression I had worn 10,000 times when an attorney was wasting my time with insufficient evidence. "Mr. Dunn," she said, "I granted the TRO based on your representation of compelling evidence. I hope you have more than timestamps and elevator footage, because what you have presented so far does not justify the emergency relief I granted." "Your Honor, we have additional evidence to present if the court will allow," Stewart said. "You have 10 minutes to justify this TRO, counselor," Judge Yates said, "or I am dissolving it and considering sanctions for frivolous filing." I met Vernon's eyes across the courtroom and gave one small nod. Trust me, this was the moment. Judge Yates had just given us exactly what we needed: visible skepticism, time pressure, and a defense team that believed they had already won. Brent had prepared Corinne perfectly for the weak evidence Stewart had presented. He had coached her through exactly how to respond to metadata analysis and surveillance footage. He had built her confidence on the foundation of circumstantial material that any competent attorney could explain away, which meant he had not prepared her for what came next. Stewart Dunn stood and said the words that would detonate the trap. "Your Honor, we call our first witness, Janine Madden, who will testify about the systematic falsification of digital trust documents under direct instruction from Corinne Weaver." I watched Corinne's face. For the first time since I had discovered her conspiracy, I saw the mask slip. Not completely, she was too well trained for that. But for one fraction of a second, her eyes widened. Her jaw tightened. The perfect composure cracked just enough to reveal what lay beneath. She had not expected this. She had prepared Brent Graves for metadata and surveillance footage. She had coached him through responses to circumstantial evidence. She had built her defense around the assumption that we would present exactly the material Stewart had shown in the first 20 minutes. But she had not prepared him for a cooperating witness from inside her own conspiracy. The courtroom deputy called Janine Madden to the stand, and I watched Corinne's carefully constructed defense begin to collapse before the real evidence had even been introduced. She had prepared Brent well for the weak evidence, but not for what was coming next. Janine Madden's testimony had been devastating. 30 minutes of technical detail explaining exactly how she had falsified digital signatures under Corinne's written instructions, complete with email timestamps and screen captures showing the directive coming directly from Corinne's corporate account. But testimony from a cooperating witness was one thing. What came next would be something else entirely. After the lunch recess, Stewart Dunn stood and said words I had been waiting to hear for 2 weeks. "Your Honor, we call Corinne Weaver to the stand." Corinne rose from the defense table, walked to the witness stand with perfect composure, and raised her right hand to swear the oath that would destroy her. She wore a charcoal suit that projected professionalism without ostentation. Her hair was pulled back in a style that suggested competence and control. When she swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, her voice was steady and clear. Brent Graves had coached her well. I could see it in every gesture, every micro-expression. She believed she could control this narrative. She believed her preparation would carry her through whatever Stewart threw at her. She was wrong. Stewart began with simple questions. Background, education, professional history, the kind of foundational material that establishes credibility and puts a witness at ease. Corinne answered each question with appropriate detail, enough to sound forthcoming, not so much as to seem rehearsed. Then Stewart shifted. Ms. Weaver, you testified in your deposition, dated November 20th, 2023, that Vernon Harlan signed the trust transfer documents using his father's distinctive silver pen. Is that correct? Corinne did not hesitate. Yes, that is correct. And you are testifying under oath today. Stewart said that Vernon Harlan used Judge Leland Harlan's silver pen to sign those documents. Yes, Corinne said, meeting Stewart's eyes with the confidence of someone stating an obvious fact. Vernon used his father's silver pen. I remember it clearly. It had engraving on the barrel and a weighted cap, very distinctive. Stewart nodded and turned to Judge Yates. Your Honor, I submit into evidence Exhibit 47, sworn affidavit from Judge Leland Harlan, notarized December 18, 2023, stating that he has never owned a silver pen during his 42 years on the federal bench. I also submit Exhibit 48 archival court records, showing photographs of Judge Harlan's courtroom workspace from 1981 through 2023, documenting the black Mont Blanc Meisterstuck fountain pen he has used exclusively for official signatures throughout his entire judicial career. The courtroom went silent for 5 seconds. I watched faces around the room process what had just happened. The spectators in the gallery, the court reporter whose hands paused over her stenography machine, Judge Yates, whose expression shifted from neutral attention to focused scrutiny. Everyone understood what had just happened except Corinne. She sat in the witness box with the same composed expression, not yet realizing that the detailed description she had just provided, under oath the engraving, the weighted cap, the distinctive appearance was evidence of fabrication, not credibility. Mrs. Weaver, Stewart said quietly, you just testified under oath that Vernon signed documents with a pen that does not exist and has never existed. Under Title 18 United States Code Section 1621, you have committed perjury. Count 1. I saw the moment it registered. The slight widening of her eyes, the barely perceptible tightening of her jaw. Brent Graves stood. Your Honor, I request an immediate recess to consult with my client. Motion denied, Judge Yates said. Ms. Weaver is under oath and will remain on the stand. Mr. Dunn, continue. Stewart pulled up the courtroom display monitor. We now present cloud-based screen recordings obtained through legal subpoena from Harlan Financial Solutions backup servers, he said. These recordings show Ms. Weaver accessing Vernon Harlan's computer on November 12, 2023 at 2:47 p.m., the exact timestamp when the asset transfer documents were electronically signed. The monitor filled with footage showing Corinne's hands on Vernon's keyboard, her face visible in the reflection of the computer screen, typing commands and accessing files, while Vernon sat beside her with the glazed, unfocused eyes I had seen in the elevator footage. We also submit toxicology evidence. Stewart continued, showing midazolam, a controlled surgical sedative present in Vernon Harlan's hair follicles, proving chemical incapacitation at the time these transfers were executed. Under Illinois contract law, involuntary intoxication voids contractual capacity. Every document signed during this chemically induced state is legally void. Corinne's face had gone pale, but she maintained her composure. Stewart played a second video clip. This one showed Corinne in what appeared to be her home office speaking into her phone's camera. Vernon used his father's silver pen, Corinne's recorded voice said. She paused, adjusted her inflection. Vernon used his father's silver pen. The engraving made it very distinctive. Another pause. I remember clearly Vernon signed the documents with his father's silver pen, the one with the engraving. She had been practicing, testing variations, perfecting the lie she would tell in deposition and later under oath. Ms. Weaver, Stewart said, turning back to her. Do you recognize this recording? Corinne's hands gripped the witness stand rail. I watched her knuckles go white. I have no knowledge of any recordings, she said. This is fabricated evidence. Your Honor, Stewart said, the witness has now committed her second count of perjury. We call Terence Stafford to establish chain of custody and authentication. Terence took the stand and testified for 15 minutes, documenting how the cloud recordings had been obtained through legal subpoena preserved with cryptographic hashing to prevent tampering and maintained under strict evidence protocols that met Federal Rules of Evidence 902. 13. For self-authenticating digital records, every piece admissible, every step documented, every claim supported by evidence that would survive appeal. When Terence finished, Stewart turned back to the monitor and played the full recording. Corinne's voice filled the courtroom, rehearsing the silver pen story over and over, testing different emotional tones, perfecting the performance she had just delivered under oath. I watched her face as she sat in the witness box, listening to her own voice prove her perjury in real time. I had spent 42 years reading defendants in federal court, learning to recognize the exact moment when they understood the verdict was inevitable. This was that moment. Corinne Weaver sat perfectly still, her hands gripping the witness stand rail, her expression frozen in the kind of control that comes from knowing you have lost, but refusing to show it. She understood she had lost not just the hearing, but everything. The trust, the conspiracy, her freedom, and there was nothing she could do about it. Judge Yates called chambers immediately after the recording ended. Stewart, Brent, Terence, and I filed into her oak-paneled office while the gallery murmured beyond the closed door. Corinne remained at the defense table with two bailiffs standing discreetly nearby. To Mr. Stafford, Judge Yates said, removing her glasses. You mentioned additional evidence. Terence opened his briefcase and withdrew 3 USB drives. Federal subpoenas served yesterday on Metropolitan Trust Bank's cloud servers. The technical team completed the extraction at 4 this morning. He handed folders to each of us. I opened mine and scanned the transaction logs. Jacques Lockwood, Terence said, pointing to highlighted entries. Senior Director of Institutional Accounts at Metropolitan Trust. 59 years old, 32 years with the bank, handles private wealth management for clients over $50 million. He processed the freeze on Vernon Harlan's accounts personally. The timestamps told the story. 3 days before the original trial date, Lockwood had flagged Vernon's accounts for suspicious activity. 6 hours later, Corinne had visited the downtown Metropolitan Trust branch. 17 minutes after she left, Lockwood had executed the freeze. The server logs show deleted emails, Terence continued. IT recovered them from backup tapes. Corinne sent Lockwood detailed instructions about which accounts to target and when to execute the freeze. She needed Vernon unable to afford legal representation. Stewart was reading through the email chains. She planned this for months. These to the communications go back 14 months, Terence said. Before Vernon ever discovered the fraud. She was building her defense strategy before he knew there was anything to defend against. Judge Yates closed her folder. Mr. Graves, does your client wish to address these allegations? Brent had gone pale. I need to consult with Ms. Weaver. You have 5 minutes, Judge Yates said. Then we reconvene. We returned to the courtroom. Brent leaned close to Corinne at the defense table, whispering urgently. She shook her head once sharply. Her composure had returned the mask back in place. She still believed she could salvage this, 42 years on the bench teaches you to recognize that particular delusion. Judge Yates took her seat. The court has reviewed evidence of additional criminal conduct. Mr. Stafford has coordinated with federal authorities regarding charges beyond the scope of this guardianship hearing. The rear doors opened. 2 federal marshals entered, moving with practiced efficiency down the center aisle. The gallery fell silent. Corinne stood as they reached the defense table. For the first time since I had met her, genuine fear crossed her face. "Corinne Weaver," the lead marshal said, "you are under arrest for perjury in violation of Title 18 United States Code, Section 1621 wire fraud, in violation of Title 18, Section 1343 obstruction of justice and conspiracy to commit fraud." The click of handcuffs echoed through the courtroom. "You have the right to remain silent," the marshal continued. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you." Brent was on his feet. "Your Honor, my client is no longer your concern, Mr. Graves," Judge Yates said quietly. "The Illinois State Bar will be reviewing your conduct as well. Sit down." The marshals led Corinne toward the doors. She turned once, looking back at the courtroom she had tried to manipulate. Her eyes found mine. I had seen that look before on countless defendants who finally understood that their schemes had failed. The doors closed behind her. Judge Yates addressed Vernon. "Mr. Harlan, this court hereby terminates the guardianship petition and restores all rights and assets to your control. The freeze on your accounts is lifted effective immediately. Court is adjourned." The gavel fell. The gallery erupted in conversation as reporters rushed for the exits. Vernon remained seated, staring at the empty defense table. Stewart was already on his phone coordinating with the federal prosecutor's office. I found Vernon in the corridor 20 minutes later. The crowds had dispersed, leaving only the usual courthouse traffic of attorneys and clerks. He stood by the windows overlooking State Street, watching the city move below. "How did you know?" he asked without turning. "From the very beginning, you knew she was lying." "How?" I stood beside him, looking down at the street, where a police transport van was pulling away from the courthouse. "The silver pen." Vernon turned to face me. For the first time in weeks, I saw not the exhausted CEO, but the boy who used to build model rockets in the garage, who asked questions until he understood every answer. "She told you I gave you a silver pen as a child," I said. "That you brought it to my courtroom when you were 8 years old." She based her entire narrative on that memory, counting on it to establish my cognitive decline. "But it never happened," Vernon said slowly. "I have never owned a silver pen. In 42 years on the bench, I used only the same black fountain pen. It sits in my study now, next to the watch your grandmother gave me when I took the oath of office. Stewart verified it through court records. Every document I signed, every order I issued bears the same black ink signature." Vernon was processing this, his analytical mind working through the implications. "So when she described this detailed memory, she revealed that someone had fabricated it for her," I finished. "The detail was too specific to be a casual lie. She had been coached, fed a false story to establish grounds for guardianship. But whoever created that story made a mistake. They invented a memory that never existed." "One mistake," Vernon said. I nodded, watching the transport van disappear into afternoon traffic. "Everyone makes one mistake. I spent 42 years waiting for it." Vernon was quiet for a long moment. Then he did something he had not done since the guardianship petition was filed. He smiled. Not the corporate smile he wore for investors, but the genuine expression I remembered from his childhood. "Thank you, Dad," he said. We stood together at the window, father and son, watching the city below. Somewhere in that transport van, Corinne was beginning to understand the cost of her fabricated silver pen. Somewhere in federal offices, prosecutors were building cases that would take years to resolve. But in that corridor, at that moment, justice felt simple again. Truth had prevailed over deception. Family had survived betrayal. The rest was just paperwork. 2 weeks after Corinne's arrest, Judge Nola Yates raised her gavel and brought it down on the order that would erase 3 years of theft. The sound echoed through courtroom 2506 of the U.S. District Court, with the finality of a door closing on a chapter I had watched unfold with equal parts patience and fury. Vernon sat beside Stuart Dunn at the plaintiff's table. The courtroom was nearly empty, no gallery, no reporters, just the quiet machinery of justice grinding through its necessary procedures. I sat in the first row behind them, watching my son's shoulders straighten as Judge Yates read from her order. The court has reviewed the medical evidence toxicology reports and witness testimony regarding the events of May 7, 2020, Judge Yates said. She was 62, a former federal prosecutor with 20 years on the bench and a reputation for thorough opinions that survived appeals. The court finds clear and convincing evidence of involuntary intoxication, rendering all contracts executed during the affected period void ab initio, from the beginning, as if they had never existed. Judge Yates continued reading. The property settlement agreement dated June 3, 2020 is hereby vacated in its entirety. The transfer of ownership shares in Harlan Financial Solutions executed pursuant to said agreement is void and of no legal effect. The freeze on the Harlan Family Trust is lifted. The waiver of inheritance signed by Vernon Harlan on June 3, 2020 is declared null and void. I watched Vernon's hand rest flat on the table. 3 years ago, that hand had signed away everything he had built. Today, a single gavel strike was giving it back. Mr. Harlan, Judge Yates said, looking directly at Vernon. Your company, your trust, and your inheritance are fully restored. The divorce settlement is vacated in its entirety. The original divorce decree itself, predicated on fraudulent grounds, is expunged from the record. 3 years of theft erased in a single order. The comprehensiveness of it was startling even to me, and I had spent 4 decades watching courts untangle fraud. Judge Yates had not simply restored Vernon's assets, she had removed every legal trace that the theft had ever occurred. The court further orders that a federal receiver shall be appointed to audit all transactions of Harlan Financial Solutions for the 18-month period beginning January 2022. Judge Yates continued. Any additional fraudulent transfers identified by said audit shall be reversed and reported to the appropriate federal authorities. Stuart was making notes on his legal pad. Vernon remained still, absorbing the magnitude of what had just been returned to him. Judge Yates set down her order. Mr. Harlan, the court recognizes that no legal remedy can fully restore what was taken from you. But the law does what it can. You have your company back. You have your family's legacy back. You have your future back. Thank you, Your Honor, Vernon said quietly. The gavel fell again. Court adjourned. We stood in the hallway, while Stuart organized the certified copies of the order. Vernon would need them for the banks, for the corporate filings, for the dozen administrative procedures required to translate a court order into operational reality. Sign here, Stuart said, pointing to lines on restoration documents. And here, initial these 2 pages. Vernon pulled a pen from his jacket pocket. Black ink, standard corporate ballpoint, nothing special. He signed his name in the quick, efficient strokes I had watched him develop over 20 years of business documents. Not silver, just black ink. And that was enough. The legal machinery continued grinding through December. I watched from my study as Stuart sent updates, as Vernon forwarded news, as the conspiracy that had taken 3 years to execute collapsed in 3 weeks. Brent Graves was disbarred on December 8th. The Illinois Attorney Registration and Disciplinary Commission issued a terse statement. Brent Matthew Graves is hereby disbarred effective immediately for conspiracy to commit fraud and violations of professional conduct rules. Federal criminal charges pending. Hugh Lockwood was terminated from Metropolitan Trust Bank on December 10th. The bank's press release cited serious violations of fiduciary duty and criminal misconduct. Federal prosecutors added wire fraud charges 2 days later. 32 years of banking career ending in handcuffs and arraignment. Janine Madden negotiated a proffer agreement. She provided testimony about Corinne's manipulation tactics in exchange for probation and community service. I felt no satisfaction in her reduced sentence. She had been a tool, not an architect. The law recognized the difference. The Thomas Keller file landed on a Chicago Police Department detective's desk on December 15th. I read about it in Stewart's email. Chicago Police Department has officially reopened the Thomas Keller death investigation as a homicide inquiry based on new evidence recovered from Corinne Weaver's archived files. Detectives are reviewing the original scene photographs and witness statements. 3 years ago, Thomas Keller had died in what appeared to be a random mugging. Now homicide detectives were examining whether Corinne had orchestrated his murder to silence the accountant who had discovered her fraud. The federal charges against her 2 counts of perjury, wire fraud, obstruction of justice, conspiracy, already carried a mandatory minimum exceeding 15 years. If the Keller investigation produced murder charges, she would die in prison. I thought about that as I sat in my study on a cold December evening. Corinne had built her scheme on the assumption that justice moved too slowly to catch her. She had counted on courts being too bureaucratic, investigators too overwhelmed, victims too exhausted to pursue every thread. She had been half right. Justice does move slowly. Federal receivers take months to audit transactions. Grand juries deliberate at their own pace. Homicide investigations follow evidence through years of cold trails. But slow is not the same as stopped. A house of cards took 3 years to build and 3 weeks to collapse. Gravity always wins eventually. The height of the structure only determines how far the pieces fall. By the end of December, Harlan Financial Solutions was fully operational under Vernon's restored control. The federal receiver had begun her audit. Corinne sat in federal detention awaiting trial on 7 felony counts. The legal machinery ground forward with the inevitability of a glacier, slow, comprehensive, inexorable. I watched it all from my study window, the city lights spreading below like a circuit board of human activity. Somewhere in those lights, Vernon was rebuilding his company. Somewhere in federal detention, Corinne was contemplating 15 years to life. Somewhere in a police evidence room, detectives were reopening a murder file. Justice moves slowly, but it moves. Legal victory is one thing. Personal healing is another. I learned the difference watching Vernon lead his executive team through fourth-quarter projections on a cold December morning. He stood at the head of the conference table in the 18th floor offices of Harlan Financial Solutions, gesturing to slides on the wall screen. Sharp, focused, alive. For the first time in 18 months, I saw my son fully present. The Q4 projections show recovery trajectory ahead of schedule, Vernon said, clicking to the next slide. We will exceed pre-crisis benchmarks by February. The executive team, 5 senior directors whose loyalty had survived 3 years of chaos, listened intently. Vernon fielded questions about client retention, regulatory compliance updates, and expansion strategies with the quick precision I remembered from before Corinne entered his life. The midazolam was completely cleared from his system. The sharp mind was fully returned. After the meeting, Vernon walked me to his office. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Lake Michigan gray water stretching to the horizon under December clouds. He closed the door and stood by the window for a long moment. I trusted the wrong person, Dad," he said finally. "How do I make sure I don't do that again?" I considered the question. 42 years on the bench had taught me that people ask for certainty when what they really need is wisdom. "You cannot always," I said. "But you can learn to read the details, the small things that do not fit." "So like the silver pen," Vernon said. "Like the silver pen." Corinne built her entire case on a fabricated memory because she needed to establish cognitive decline. But she did not verify the detail. She assumed a plausible story would be sufficient. The detail revealed the lie. Vernon turned from the window. "So I look for the details that do not fit. And you trust people who earn it slowly," I said. "Not the ones who demand it immediately." He nodded. We stood in silence watching the lake. Father and son, both older than we had been 3 years ago. Both wiser about the cost of misplaced trust. That night alone in my study, I opened a file I had not reviewed in 15 years. United States versus Wendell Eugene Weaver. Case number 08-CR2847. Securities fraud trial from May 2008. The transcript was 300 pages bound in federal court blue covers. I turned to the sentencing hearing. Wendell Weaver had orchestrated a securities fraud scheme that defrauded investors of $47 million. The evidence was overwhelming falsified quarterly reports, fabricated audit documents, offshore accounts designed to hide stolen funds. The jury deliberated 90 minutes before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. I had sentenced him to 15 years in federal prison, so the law was clear, I said aloud to the empty study. The evidence was overwhelming. I would make the same ruling today. But I remembered something else from that sentencing hearing. A young woman in the gallery, 23 years old, watching her father taken away in chains. She had sat perfectly still while the marshals let him out. No tears, no outburst. Just cold observation. "Corinne Weaver," I set down the transcript and walked to the window. The city spread below lights against darkness. Somewhere in those lights, Vernon was rebuilding his company. Somewhere in federal detention, Corinne was awaiting trial for crimes that echoed her father's fraud. Was justice served when Wendell Weaver went to prison? Yes, the law required it. The evidence demanded it. 15 years was the appropriate sentence for the magnitude of his fraud. Did that justice create the woman who poisoned Vernon? Also, yes. Judicial decisions ripple forward through lives in ways no gavel can measure. I had fulfilled my duty that day in 2008. I had applied the law fairly and correctly. But I had never asked what happens to the daughter who watches her father taken away. The law does not require that question. Moral complexity exists beyond verdicts. I was not guilty of anything. But I was not innocent of consequences either. I returned to my desk and pulled out the bottom drawer. Inside, stacked in careful order, were my handwritten investigation notes. Yellow legal pad pages covered in my precise script, documenting every step of the case that had consumed the last 3 months. The first page bore a single line. This was not a divorce. This was a heist. Still true. I flipped through the pages. Timelines of account freezes. Analysis of the silver pen fabrication. Medical research on midazolam effects. The perjury trap blueprint. Stewart's contact information. Terrence's background check results. Every detail that had led us from Vernon's desperate phone call to Corinne's arrest. I had known from the moment the phone rang that this would be my last case. A judge does not come out of retirement to save his son and then return to retirement as if nothing had changed. This was the final case of my 42-year career. I had not known if we would win. I folded the yellow pages carefully one by one and carried the stack to the fireplace. The gas logs were already burning low. I placed the first page on the flames and watched my handwriting curl into ash. 3 minutes, 40 seconds. I said, checking my watch as the last page disappeared. 42 years. Fitting conclusion. The fire consumed the final case. Everything I had learned, everything I had fought for, everything that mattered, reduced to ash and heat and the faint smell of burning paper. The physical record was gone. The victory remained. The fire died to embers. I sat in the quiet dark of my study watching the last orange glow fade to black. Vernon was safe. His company restored his mind clear, his future returned. Corinne would face justice. 7 federal felony counts, 15 years minimum, possibly murder charges for Thomas Keller. The final case was closed. 42 years on the bench had taught me that justice is never simple. It ripples forward, and backward through lives in ways no gavel can measure. Wendell Weaver deserved prison. Corinne deserved consequences. Vernon deserved vindication. All of it was true simultaneously. But justice still mattered. It still moved. Slowly, inexorably, comprehensively. I sat in the darkness and felt 42 years lift from my shoulders. Not erased, not forgotten, simply complete. The last ember faded. The study was dark. I was finished. Vernon knocked at 7:30 on New Year's Eve morning, holding 2 pastries from the bakery 3 blocks down. "Brought the almond croissants," he said. They were out of the chocolate ones. No phone call, no emergency. Just my son at my door on a cold December morning, carrying breakfast. We moved into the kitchen with an easy familiarity that had not existed 3 months ago. Vernon set the pastries on the counter while I filled the coffee maker. The morning ritual unfolded without discussion. He knew where I kept the plates. I knew he took his coffee black. We both understood the comfortable silence of 2 people who had survived something together. The kitchen faced east toward Lake Michigan. Through the window, the water was transitioning from night black to gray dawn. The coffee maker gurgled and hissed. I poured into mugs I had owned for 20 years. Heavy ceramic, no decoration, designed for function rather than aesthetics. We sat across from each other as pale winter light began filtering through the glass. "Coffee is still in the same place it has been for 20 years, I said. Vernon smiled. "I know. I remember." The transformation struck me quietly. 3 months ago, Vernon had sat in this same kitchen, desperate and drugged, fighting to articulate what had been stolen from him. Today he sat relaxed, present, whole. The sharp clarity I remembered from his childhood had returned. More than that, the easy companionship we had lost somewhere in his corporate ascent had been restored. We ate in comfortable silence. The almond croissants were still warm, flaking onto the plates with each bite. "Board voted yesterday to expand the Chicago office," Vernon said eventually. "We are hiring again." "Ahead of schedule," I said. Stewart confirmed the federal receiver's preliminary audit came back clean. Corinne was thorough, but she was not creative. Everything went through the same 3 accounts. I nodded. Criminals often made that mistake, finding a method that worked and repeating it until the pattern became their exposure. "What are you going to do now, Dad?" Vernon asked after a while. "Really, do I mean, now that it is over?" I looked out at the lake. The question deserved an honest answer. "I do not know yet," I said. Vernon studied me across the table. "That might be the first time I have ever heard you say that." He was right. For 42 years, I had known exactly what I would do: arrive at chambers, review case files, conduct hearings, issue rulings, go home, repeat. Every day had a defined purpose. Every decision had legal framework. Now there were no cases, no chambers, no gavel. Just open, undefined, uncertain future. Is that frightening? Vernon asked. No, I said, surprised to find it was true. It feels like freedom. I might travel, I said after a moment. Your mother always wanted to see Ireland. I told her we would go after I retired, but we ran out of time. You should go, Vernon said, or I might volunteer at the legal aid clinic. Or I might simply do nothing for a while, read books, walk by the lake, drink coffee with my son when he stops by with pastries. Vernon smiled. I can do that more often. I would like that. The light through the window was stronger now, gray dawn shifting toward pale morning. But in my kitchen in this moment, there was just coffee and pastries and easy silence. Vernon sat across from me, present and whole and free. This was what came after justice. Not celebration or triumph or vindication. Just quiet morning coffee with my son. Just open future without definition. Just peace. It looked exactly right. Vernon left at noon, promising to return for dinner on the 2nd. I stood alone in my study on the final afternoon of the year, watching the Chicago skyline stretch beneath a pale winter sky, and considered 42 years. The city spread below in geometric patterns of steel and glass. Somewhere in those buildings, lawyers were preparing briefs, judges reviewing motions, witnesses rehearsing testimony they hoped would be believed. I had spent 4 decades listening to those witnesses, 42 years, thousands of cases heard, thousands of rulings that reduced to a single fundamental question: what is true and what is constructed? The skill I had developed was simple to describe and difficult to master, noticing the details liars always miss. Every liar believes their story is airtight. They prepare with meticulous care, rehearsing answers until they sound natural, constructing explanations that account for every known variable. They sit in the witness box, convinced they have thought of everything. They are always wrong. The truth hides in details too small to rehearse, a timeline that shifts by 15 minutes between tellings. A crucial conversation that happened on a date when the witness was provably elsewhere. A vivid description of weather that contradicts meteorological records. Small things, forgettable things, fatal things. My final case had been solved exactly this way. Corinne Weaver understood the importance of detail. She knew that vague accusations would be insufficient to establish guardianship over a wealthy CEO. She needed specific, credible evidence of cognitive decline. So she constructed a careful narrative. As a child, Vernon had visited my courtroom and signed documents with my silver pen, a cherished gift he had given me himself. The detail was precise, specific, emotionally resonant. Exactly the kind of concrete memory that sounds credible because it contains texture and particularity. It was completely false. I never owned a silver pen in 42 years on the bench. Stewart verified it through court records. Every document I had ever signed bore the same black ink from the same black fountain pen that now rested in a drawer in my study. No silver pen had ever existed. One detail. That was all it took. The lie that sounds most true is always the one that kills you. If Corinne had simply claimed I was forgetful, the accusation would have been harder to disprove. But she invented a concrete object, and concrete objects leave concrete trails. Or in this case, leave no trail at all. I walked to my desk and opened the drawer. The black fountain pen lay beside the watch my late wife had given me the day I took my oath. Simple, functional, real. The afternoon light was fading, the winter sun sinking toward the lake. The year was ending. The case was closed. Vernon was free. Corinne awaited trial. 42 years had taught me one principle: truth is patient, lies are not. Truth survives scrutiny because it has nothing to fear from examination. Lies require constant maintenance, immediate acceptance, sustained belief. The moment you ask a liar to wait while you verify their claims, the lie begins collapsing under its own weight. Corinne had not wanted to wait. She needed immediate guardianship, immediate control, immediate access before anyone looked too closely. That urgency was part of the lie itself. But I had waited, and a silver pen that did not exist had emerged from patient examination. No lie is ever perfect. There is always something the liar misses, always a detail too small to seem important until someone notices it. Always a silver pen waiting to unravel everything. You just have to be patient enough to find it. And to you listening to my story, remember this. I spent 42 years believing justice was simple: follow the law, make the right ruling, move forward. But when I sentenced Wendell Weaver 15 years ago, I never considered what happens to the daughter watching her father taken away. That correct ruling planted seeds that nearly destroyed my son. Don't assume justice exists in isolation from its human consequences. Here's what I learned. Family justice isn't just about courtrooms. It's about protecting those you love by staying vigilant, noticing details others miss. Every liar believes their story is perfect, but there's always something, a silver pen that never existed, a timeline that doesn't match. I believe God's timing is perfect, even when invisible. He gave me 42 years of training for the one case that mattered most. This wasn't just another of those dad's revenge stories. This was about applying everything I'd learned to save my son. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What do you think about dad's revenge stories like this one? Have you ever had to fight for family justice? Share this with someone who needs to hear that truth always surfaces. And if you believe in stories where patience and wisdom triumph, please subscribe to Wise Revenge. Thank you for staying until the very end. As a final note, some elements of this story have been fictionalized for impact and reflection. But the core lesson remains true. No lie is ever perfect, and family is always worth fighting for.